Good afternoon and welcome to WHU Inside Business. I am here with Dr. Rob Britton, professor at Georgetown University and former managing director of advertising at American Airlines. This is where I really wanted to get into it because you at American Airlines were the managing director of advertising during the 9/11 crisis. Now, I remember as a second grader, I was 7. Of course, the first plane hit a little bit after 5 a.m. California time, and we still all had to go to school, but in school they put us all into the library, turned on the TVs but wouldn't let us watch. And all the teachers were whispering and being very concerned, but my memories were very vague, but I know it was very sheltered. I was very sheltered and didn't really understand what was going on until later that week. I'm wondering, at that time when I'm sitting in the library, what was Dr. Rob Britton doing?
Well, that's a good and painful question. I was actually on the telephone right immediately after our first plane hit one of the towers of the World Trade Center. And I was talking to a colleague, and I could hear in the background all this noise and commotion. And I said, "Susie, what's going on over where you are?" She said, "Rob, I'll call you back," click, and hung up. And I walked, she was on the same floor as me in the building, and I walked over there and they had a radio on. This is, before the internet. We scrambled that day on September 11, 2001, we scrambled to find televisions that worked in the building. But we finally, started to get up to speed on what was going on. I mean, we initially didn't know it was one of our airplanes. So as the day unfolded, and of course the three planes that hit buildings and the plane that crashed, the United Airlines plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. I mean, all that happened within 2 hours. Airspace was closed. I was actually not yet in the advertising job. I was finishing up a temporary assignment for the company. And when that happened, I was deeply concerned, in fact worried, to the extent that I worry, which is not very much. But I was worried that because I was finishing this temporary assignment, I didn't really have a permanent job. Depending on how grave the crisis was going to be, I was going to lose my job. Either everyone was going to lose their job because the company was going to go out of business, but I certainly, if we survived, might be a candidate for losing my job because I don't have a permanent position. So there was, a couple of weeks' time. It was it was about 10 days' time when I'm like, what's going to happen? 10 days after 9/11, senior VP comes into my office and says, we'd like you to, would you be interested in becoming the head of advertising? And of course, there was about a nanosecond between him asking the question and me replying, "Yes, Henry, that would be just great, thank you." So in I went, and so what that meant, Nicholas, was I really had a front row seat on crisis management of the most serious nature.
So how long did it take, for things after you became managing director, how long did it take for things to get back to normal?
I think it was probably about 9 months. And it depends a little bit on how you define normal. And one of the other things that the audience might be interested in is that the media at the time, and even now, even to today, 19 years later, the media and even some experts in business schools and marketing authors and others tend to get it wrong. They would at the time and even today tell you that it was the 9/11 attacks that put the worldwide airline industry into a sort of downward trajectory. The truth is that there were a number of larger macro forces that predated 9/11. 9/11 was a tragedy, but prior to that, there was at American and other companies in the U.S. a big downturn in business travel demand in the early 2000-2001 period. And also, at that point, this was the point when the newer companies with much lower costs, like Southwest and JetBlue, were really starting to grow and get traction. So they were exercising enormous downward pressure on revenues, and our costs were high. Now, 9/11 was a tragedy for the nation, for the company. But the number of, in terms of an actual revenue decline that was caused by 9/11, I would say it this way. We did some market research immediately after the attacks, and we determined that less than 4% of our target audience was so afraid that they wouldn't fly. Because and we were, of course, happy that that was as low as it was, and a little bit surprised. Had that number been 10%, we would have been out of business. So in that point, if that were the case, 9/11 would have killed us.
So what did 9/11 do to the?
Well, it obviously, the sort of psychological trauma, and the practical impacts of not knowing. The uncertainty drove a lot of just very sort of radical decisions on the part of the company. We didn't know quickly how much air travel was going to be affected. So within 20 days, we had reduced our schedule by 20%. Oh, wow. I mean, imagine a manufacturing company, shuttering 20% of their productive capacity. We had parked 20% of our fleet. We had cut back 20% of our flying. We had done all these other things. And by the way, to bring it back to, if you will, to Washington, one of the other things that absolutely had to get done was the Congress of the United States passed some legislation providing backstop insurance. So the government of the United States became the insurer of last resort, and they also passed some legislation that put into place some liability, because absent that liability limit and absent the government providing sort of reinsurance as the last resort, again, we would have been out of business because we wouldn't have been able to get insurance. And you cannot, no company can operate without insurance, but particularly an airline. So it was plenty serious.
But how much of this crisis affected American Airlines specifically, or the entire airline industry?
That's a great question. We were not, so to recap, because it's been a long time, 4 airplanes were involved that day. 2 belonged to American and 2 belonged to United. Yeah. Neither United nor American were disproportionately impacted. In other words, every airline's revenues took a hit. We were not singled out for the most part. I mean, at a small margin, for example, our sales here in Europe took a hit for a little bit because people saw us as a target and possibility that there would be other attacks and stuff, but it was short term.
Interesting.
So the whole industry took a temporary turn down. But again, it was, as I said, because the number of people that were actually afraid to fly was pretty small. I mean, it was a really modest downturn.
So how does American Airlines, or when you were in place as managing director of advertising, how did American Airlines advertise?
So what we did in the wake of the attacks, the first thing that we did was a lot of research. We needed to know what was going on. So we did a great deal of market research, and just to kind of summarize that, one of the key insights that we were able to find out was that in the wake of the attacks, people were very inwardly focused. They were sort of more turning back towards friends and family. And so we used that insight to develop a campaign called the Great American Get Together. That was the objective of the campaign. Obviously, the objective was to try to drive revenue and get people flying again, and encourage them to fly. But the message was, if you're focused on friends and family, if that's who's important to you, and they live a long way, you're going to need to fly. Right?
Yeah.
So if there was anything at all positive about the timing of the attacks being in mid-September, it was we were a couple of months before Thanksgiving, the big national holiday in the United States, and the end-of-year religious holidays. And so we developed some very cool advertising, which you can find, by the way, on YouTube, in the wake of that. They're very emotional advertising. I mean, people look at it today and go, "Wow, that's really powerful." That's what we did. Exactly. And the other thing that we did, of course, is we lowered prices. It sounds kind of curious to think that you go, okay, if you lower prices, are people less afraid? It's not exactly that, but if you lower prices, they're going to buy plane tickets, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the people that are just on the border, if you make it $50 cheaper, they go, oh, let's go, right?
Yeah.
And so we lowered prices. Now, the thing about lowering prices in the airline business, of course, it's going to, make your financial position even worse if you don't do anything about costs. But the airline business is a business where fixed expenses 70 to 80% of total. So if you commit to operating a schedule on October 1, 2001, even if that schedule is 20% smaller, you're still committing to almost 600 airplanes.
Yeah.
So you've committed to the expense, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have to pay for the airplanes, you're going to have to pay for the rent at Chicago Airport, et cetera, et cetera. Lower the prices, see if you can't drive some increased demand, because it's a demand elastic business.
Yes.
That's the reality. So there you have it.
And before the crisis, I mean, American Airlines was advertising on TV or in airports, like what?
Oh, sure.
What was the main?
Broadly based advertising plan using, all of the media that are available. So it's TV, it's radio, it's newspapers and magazines. It's a little bit of internet, although after I became head, we took the internet spend way up.
Yeah. Gotcha. But after 9/11, then, did you go immediately into the ad campaign, or?
No, great question. No, we went, as they say in the ad business, we went dark for about a month.
Okay.
And this Great American Get Together campaign, we launched somewhere around the 20th of October.
Gotcha.
And one of the reasons we went dark was just because, you're in the news all the time. It's very typical in the wake of say a plane crash or some tragedy in the business or some, a strike or something, to pull your advertising down. And obviously that made a lot of sense. One of the other things that we needed to find out, I alluded a little bit to market research. We did a lot of it. Some of the proprietary market research that we did, that is stuff that American did itself. One of the things that we needed to find out was, would people think that advertising was somehow ugly, or just, would they object?
Is it insulting to the people that die?
Exactly. Yeah. Would they see it as insulting that the company whose planes were involved in the attack are now out promoting themselves?
Yeah.
And what was interesting to us is overwhelmingly, the public came back and said to us, they said, no, you've got a business to run. Whatever you need to do that. And it was very interesting. There was a big chunk of that group. I mean, I can't remember what exactly the numbers, 70 or 80% of the people said, go do it. And a big chunk of people said to us, if we saw an ad for American Airlines, it would make us feel like the country was getting back to normal.
Interesting.
And of course, that made us feel good.
And that, leads me into a question I've been wondering, but how do you leverage advertising and marketing to change the narrative?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would, to be modest and realistic, it's a hard thing to do. Air travel, airline services are a commodity product. They're a product where there is very little actual sustainable differentiation. The planes all go the same speed, they use the same airports, same. So advertising can only be used to a fairly limited extent to drive choice, to drive repeat purchase. The really most effective marketing strategy and marketing program that airlines use are loyalty programs.
Yeah.
Those work better than anything. And I'm always honest with students when I give a talk on, airline advertising, and somebody asks, well, does advertising make a big difference? I go, probably not. What makes a big difference are loyalty programs.
Interesting, yeah. This kind of ties into a crisis that we're seeing now with Boeing.
Yes.
And this 737 MAX.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure this affects American Airlines because American Airlines probably owns a bunch of these planes.
They do. But
if you were working for, that would be a very hard job. But if you were working for Boeing right now and they're advertising, what would you do?
Boeing has, as a crisis management expert, as a professor of crisis management, I'm giving Boeing very low marks for managing this crisis. Specifically, lack of visibility by senior members of the company, lack of humanity, lack of any countervailing narrative. There's a principle of crisis management that says, a best practice, if you will, in crisis management that says, don't deny the crisis over here. And by the way, they did a little bit of denial. They've been more forthcoming lately. Own up to your mistakes over here. But while you're owning up and being transparent and being humane and being real people over here, you should put a message out over here. Now, you can't do this yourself. Find some proxies. Put out a message over here that is positive and that's defending the company. The reality is, however many mistakes Boeing may have made at the 737 MAX, and we're not here to debate those, everyone pretty much has a grip on what that is. The reality is that they have historically been an outstanding company, a company that for 100 years have built safe and reliable airplanes, outstanding machines, machines that have, as time has gone on, become better and safer. The fact that they had a fallback over here, nobody's denying that. But they needed, through proxies, through other experts, through other people, to tell that story. And the truth is, not just Boeing, but the entire commercial aviation ecosystem. My great frustration was no one was out there talking about how astonishingly safe commercial flight has become.
It's true.
In the United States, there has not been a plane crash for 11 years. In those 11 years, one person has died. The plane has not crashed. Southwest Airlines had an in-flight engine explosion a couple of years ago. The pilot was able to land the plane. One person unfortunately died. 9 billion passengers carried, an average of about 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, one death. That's an astonishing record. It's an astonishing record.
So it seems to me that it's very different, the crisis that Boeing is having right now and the crisis American Airlines had. I mean, it's similar, they have to do with airlines, but did American Airlines make a mistake?
No. I mean, no one, certainly every airline since about the 1970s and 80s have been aware of the risk of terrorism, okay? In the 1980s, there were a number of hijackings in the Middle East, and a lot of the big brands were affected, the big brands at the time, like Pan Am and TWA. You may be aware that in 1989, there was a horrific terrorist incident that brought down a Pan Am 747 over Scotland. So airlines have been keenly focused on the prospect of terrorism. And, you know, airline security departments work very closely with governments in terms of security risk and all those sorts of things. But I think if you look at if you talk to people who are honest enough that worked in the intelligence community in the United States or here in Germany, very few people could have seen something like that coming. Now, in hindsight, did we make a mistake? Not American Airlines, but did the U.S. airline industry, in cooperation with the federal government in the United States, did we collectively, together, did we make a mistake in allowing airport security screening to be outsourced to low-cost producers, which meant they were hiring people that didn't care about their jobs, which meant that the bad guys were able to smuggle the weapons, the box cutters? Yeah, that was a mistake in hindsight. Sure it was.
And, you know, some people use these words risk management and crisis management interchangeably. Can you help clarify what is the difference? Your focus was crisis management, but why do people mix those up?
Yeah, there is a difference. Sort of risk management is a sort of a larger concept that would involve a systematic assessment across an entire company of all the things that could go wrong. And systematic and across. And when I say that, I don't mean, you know, if you're a manufacturing company, you're only going to talk about, you know, the possibility of something bad happening at a factory or something bad happening once your product is delivered to the end user, an automobile or a toaster or whatever. I'm talking about today, systematic risk management includes things like HR policies. You know, do you have a sexual harassment policy in place? Because if you don't, and something bad happens, now you're in the middle of a crisis. So risk management is an overarching issue that if you really are good at assessing a risk, you're going to minimize the prospect that one of those risks will become a crisis.
Yeah,
that will need to be managed. Is that clear?
Fair.
So that's really what happens. When I teach crisis management, early on, I have a slide that has, it's almost like you have to squint to read all the different possibilities because they're very broad.
Yeah.
And those are all things that across the entire organization need to be assessed.
Gotcha.
Because the best way to manage a crisis is to keep it from happening.
So, I mean, you started with American Airlines in the midst of a crisis. Did you then formulate a risk management plan after that, in the wake of everything that happened?
So to make that real, way before 9/11,
Yeah.
okay, airlines were doing systematic risk assessment. The kind of risk assessment that I propose, a company like American, a well-run company, was doing that way before, okay, looking across. Now, admittedly, much of that focus was on the operations side of the business. But beginning in the 1980s and 90s, frankly, there was a lot more focus on internal factors and internal issues and things that could go wrong internally, such as sexual harassment, such as gender discrimination, these kinds of things that if they become public and on the outside, they become. So we may not have entirely called it comprehensive risk assessment or risk management, but people were looking at these things long before. Now, with respect to the specific aspect of crisis management, a well-run airline like American, and this would be true of Lufthansa and other big companies, have for a long time had crisis management plans in place to address the major, most likely operational incidents, including, I mean, the two that were really, the two big ones that come to mind would be an airplane crash in a situation at an airport. Whatever that might be, either a fire in the terminal building or a terrorist attack in the terminal building or whatever. Those would be kind of the two big places where things would be, where crisis management would really come to fore. And to go back really early in my career, the first job that I had with a small company called Republic Airlines in 1984, not long after I started, I became aware of the fact that the airline had a crisis management plan, because not only did we have a plan at that point, a thick binder of who was going to do what, but we would actually, at that little airline, 175 airplanes, we actually exercised that crisis plan 2 times a year, trying it out in a mock drill to make sure it works. And by the way, that's a best practice.
Interesting. So, here at WHU, there's a strong startup culture, and the entrepreneurial mindset is, ingrained in our classes. I'm wondering, how does risk management and forming a risk management plan differ for large established companies like American Airlines and, say, a startup with, maybe a dozen employees or something like this?
I'm going to be very provocative here and say it really does not differ, in the sense that whether you're a startup with 3 people or an enormous company like BASF, you need a risk management plan. You need you need a risk management assessment, and you need a crisis management plan. And the crisis management plan should exist in both places. I was talking to some startups in Bulgaria a couple of years ago, and I offered the view that even if you're a startup, you're going to need a plan. And the people are going, "We don't need a plan." I said, "Yes, you do, because suppose your code is hijacked, or suppose hackers get into your system, or suppose you have an incident of workplace misconduct that becomes something that's in the newspaper or that gets the attention of government." I said to these entrepreneurs, I said, even if you spent an afternoon and wrote down on a single side of a single piece of paper a crisis management plan, handwritten, it would be better than none at all. So yes, everyone needs one.
And this plan, what are the main elements of it? If you're in a small company.
No, exactly. So the main elements are, firstly, to start out before you have a plan to do that comprehensive risk assessment. That's where you start. Understand where are the places, where are the major pools of risk in the organization. And then in each of those pools, you need a crisis management plan that would address or mitigate or manage what would happen if one of those things became a crisis. What would happen if your code were stolen? What would happen if hackers got into your system and busted into your servers? What would happen if you had workplace misconduct? What would happen if you had financial malfeasance, right? Just those are 4 examples for a startup.
Yeah. In kind of tying it back to airplanes and airlines, you mentioned in a previous interview that your mission is about mobility and getting people mobile and able to travel. Now, just interesting question I had on my mind was, do you think supersonic flight and supersonic airplanes should be brought back?
No. Well, it's not a question of it's not a question of should.
Yeah.
It's a question of will. Most of your audience and you as well took physics in high school. When you took physics, you learned about resistance and friction, and that's the key limiter. You can in aviation, in things that fly above the earth, when you're still subject to gravity and you're still within the atmosphere, you have to overcome gravity and you have to overcome resistance. You can do those things and go faster than about 1,100 kilometers, but to do so you have to overcome that resistance, and that takes a great deal of energy. There's no way around that. So the people who have attempted to build supersonic civil aircraft, including, a very interesting example 60 years ago with an airplane called the Concorde.
Yeah.
The Concorde was 2 hours New York to Frankfurt, 2 hours and 20 minutes. It was very fast, but it was very expensive to operate. And those same laws of physics that you learned in high school still exist.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, there's some Silicon Valley startups. There's 2 and perhaps even 3 companies building supersonic transports. They're starting small now, and they want to sell one to, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. He'll have enough money to buy one. They would, if they're successful with that, and they're going to use all new technology, but they still have to overcome resistance. It's going to take a lot of energy. Now, the interesting thing is that increased energy consumption comes at a time when there's an enormous amount of pushback about energy consumption and CO2 emissions in commercial aviation. So I think you're going to have a smackdown here that is going to be very interesting to watch.
Well, we'll watch with interest. Rob, thank you again for this wonderful interview and your valuable insights.
Thank you, Nicholas. I've enjoyed being with you all.
And from all of us here at WHU Inside Business, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.